Thousands of displaced Gazans started returning to their homes to check for damage on Friday, while Israelis returned to normal life as a ceasefire appeared to take hold after 11 days of deadly fighting. The ceasefire came into force in the Gaza Strip after Egypt and Qatar brokered an agreement between Israel and Hamas to halt 11 days of bloodshed. Now, how are those affected dealing with the aftermath currently? To give us perspective and knowledge on what the latest developments are on the ground, we're joined by Palestinian journalist living in the UK, Yousef Alhelou. Thank you so much for your time this morning on Weekend Report. Yousef, let's start with that question. How are those affected dealing with this, especially some of them having to sift through the rubble with very poor resources, mind you, to find their loved ones?
Yes, thank you for having me. Following the announcement of the ceasefire mediated by those countries that you just mentioned, the residents of the Gaza Strip, they left the shelters and their homes to inspect the damage that was caused by Israel's relentless aggression on Gaza. Piles of rubble is filling the streets, and those who were seeking shelter at the United Nations run schools, and those who were hiding at hospitals and elsewhere, they left those places, and they now they're trying to salvage what they can to collect their belongings from under the rubble. More dead bodies were pulled out from under the rubble. So people are, facing these hardships. Each Israeli war on Gaza or aggression, and they know that Israel wanted to destroy their livelihood so that they suffer more hardships. But unfortunately, this ceasefire, despite the fact it is still holding, it's fragile. Escalation might break out any time, because we know this is a temporary ceasefire. This will not end the root of the problem, which is the military occupation of the Palestinian territories. And only a day after this fire was agreed, Israeli occupation forces they opened fire and tear gas at Palestinian worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque. So the problem is still there. It seems that Israel wanted to inflict heavy damage in the Gaza Strip. It wanted to send Gaza to the Stone Age. It wanted to put the blame on the Palestinian side in Gaza, the resistance, to say, look, as long as you support those fighters or the resistance groups, then you will have to suffer. Now, the reconstruction of Gaza will have to start. Pledges of money have been made. Aid convoys will start coming to Gaza via Egypt. The humanitarian situation is still miserable. It is worsening. It has been worse since 2007, when Israel started to impose a siege. So Israel wants to show that the situation in Gaza is a humanitarian one, and it is a result because of the extremist or the resistance groups. But as a matter of fact, people say Israel is the aggressor, the oppressor, and they are willing to sacrifice their souls to protect their land, mainly the holy city of Jerusalem, Al-Quds.
Yousef, of course, this move has drawn reaction across the globe. We also heard Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, also touching on how this move should now be a way in which the root of the conflict should now begin, the conversation should begin around getting some sort of solutions. When it comes to the real efforts to address the root causes of the conflict, where are we standing?
Well, now we are to square zero. Those international bodies, the international community, the UN, the US administration, now they are talking about two-state solution, which was born dead. Palestinians and Israelis have been negotiating for the past 25 years, and everybody knows it is Israel who is not willing to end the occupation. And you cannot talk about two-state solution, about peaceful settlement to the conflict, when Israel is rejecting any peaceful, serious agreements. The Palestinian side, they have made many concessions, starting from Arafat and then Abbas now. Israeli Prime Minister himself, he says the land is too small to have two states. Israel created a de facto situation on the ground by grabbing more Palestinian lands, by making Palestinian lives miserable. There are around 600 security checkpoints around the West Bank, slicing the West Bank. It's like Bantustans. Palestinian citizens, villages are isolated. There is the apartheid wall around the occupied West Bank. Israel is still occupying, many territories, stealing and confiscating natural resources. There are around 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails. The water resources are being controlled by Israel. The Palestinian people do not have an airport or seaport. Israel controls everything, every aspect of Palestinians' lives. So to have a sovereignty, to have an independent state, Israel has to give up its control. It has to give up its military occupation, the longest military occupation in our modern time, since 1948, and the Palestinians have been fighting for self-determination. So the international community, if they're serious about putting an end to the violence in the Middle East, they have to pressure Israel to end its impunity, to respect international law, and to show really that they are applying the international conventions, and to allow Israeli officials and war criminals to be held accountable. Because without accountability, Israel is laughing, and it will carry on more aggressions and more wars against the Palestinians.
Both Israel and Hamas claimed victories once the ceasefire was put into effect yesterday, and it sort of kind of speaks to nobody wanting to retreat. Instead, there must always be a winner. And, do you think that we're closer to any solution now that we have this ceasefire than we were 11 days ago, before this deadly spate of violence which killed more than 250 people took place?
Yes, you're right. Both sides claim victory. I can tell you something. Israel did not win the war, and the Palestinians were not defeated. This is the formula here. Because for the last 11 days, before the ceasefire was announced, Palestinian resistance groups, who are being supported by the vast majority of Palestinians, because obviously Palestinians have a right for self-defense, they did not stop their fire rocket. They continued to fire their homemade rockets deep inside Israeli cities such as Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa and Akka and Negev and Beersheba. And the Israeli side claiming victory. And we can call it a dirty victory, because they only destroyed infrastructure, they killed civilians, they caused massive devastation, and you cannot claim this is a victory, because the Palestinian morale is still high. Palestinians, they poured out to the streets across the Palestinian territory to celebrate the victory, because Palestinians, they did not raise the white flag, and it was unconditional ceasefire. It was agreed from both sides, I agree, but at the end of the day, the Israeli society is blaming Netanyahu. The Israeli society, they said they are embarrassed to be in bunkers for 11 days, whereas Israel was flexing its missiles, using excessive force against defenseless civilians, and Israel was receiving at the time around $750 million in aid, whereas Palestinians are not allowed to arm themselves, they're not allowed to resist. So we experience international hypocrisy, international conspiracy of silence, and this cannot go on. You cannot blame the victim, and you only support the victimizer. You support the colonizer, the occupier. So I think we will have to make sure that Israel doesn't, violate Palestinians' rights anymore, because the flashpoint was Jerusalem Al-Aqsa Mosque. And only, as I said, hours after the ceasefire was announced, Israeli occupation forces, they provoked Palestinians and they fired tear gas. So as long as Israel enjoys a culture of impunity, then we will not see a settlement to the conflict.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time and thorough analysis there, giving us the latest developments. Palestinian journalist living in the UK, Yousef Alhelou.